This is Saturday, June 10th. We're going to take a raw file and we're going to open it in Adobe Camera Raw and correct any problems in exposure. And then we will open it in the editor and we'll go ahead and apply some Viveza2 adjustments to it. I feel it's important to correct the basic exposure before you go to any NICS software. So if you will work with me, so if you're in your the editor of your software and you go to File, Open, you will look at the Saturday class for June 10th and you'll find an Alaska file called Alaska9956.crw. That CRW extension is a Canon extension, an early Canon extension for a raw formatted file. So once that's chosen, if you click Open, you will open the Alaska file. Now I need to alert you that if you got a copy of this file that had been adjusted before and you want to set it back to its original settings so that you can work with it just out of the camera, you need to do several things. One, in the middle of this window, you see the word default. If you have changes that were made and you click the word default, all of these middle sliders will go back to 0. You then need to look up at the white balance. If it doesn't say as shot, it means it was changed. And you need to return that slider to as shot so that it's just the way it came from the camera. And at the bottom 3 sliders, if any one of them is off 0, if you grab the slider and double click, it'll pop back to 0. And you will have this image exactly the way it came from the camera. And we need to do one more thing to make this really work for you today. If you had to make changes on this file and it's set back to its originals, I want you to find the word Done. And when you click Done, it will close the file and remember what you just did to it, that you set it back to its original default. So click the word Done. That image will close, but now it's ready to be started, just like it came from the camera. So now we'll go back to File, Open, and we'll find the Alaska file that you just changed, and you will open it. And this time when it opens, everything will be back to the default. And this is important because I want you to see before and after images when we work. And if we don't get it back to its original setting, you won't get a good before to go with the after. So my image is ready now. It has no sliders adjusted. So we're going to look at this and say, what did it look like when it came out of the camera? Well, unfortunately, it wasn't exposed quite correctly. Look at the histogram. We try to expose our images so that the pixels come all the way to the right edge but don't go beyond the end. And we want to make sure that the bright parts of this image have been properly recorded by the sensor. And so if I had looked at this image out in the field right after I took it, and I saw a histogram that looked like that, I would know I needed to increase the exposure and take it over again. But since I can't go back and take it over, we're going to increase the exposure of the entire image. The slider that will do that is called exposure. And when I raise the exposure with this slider, all of the pixels are brightened. And I don't want to overdo the brights. So I'm not going to absolutely go all the way to the right. When I raise the exposure slider, these pixels here will start to move toward the right and the whole image will move toward the right. I'm going to stop before that point gets all the way to the edge because I don't want to overdo it. So grab the exposure slider, start dragging it over, and before it gets all the way to the right, I'm going to stop. And I went to about a plus 0.85. And so I've taken care of the problems that were created when the picture was originally captured. And now I can fine-tune the exposure using the camera raw controls. So if you will look down at the rest of this middle block, you'll find one called whites. That control will only take the very brightest pixels, stretch them out to the right, or if they were overexposed, it would bring them back. And I want to get those fine whites to the point where they're right at the edge before they get overexposed. And to do that, I need a help. And the help I'm going to get comes from holding down the Alt-Option key, which I will do now. And then I will grab the whites slider, and I'll start dragging it. And guess what happens? As soon as I grab it, the picture turns black. And I'm going to start sliding and watch the black picture. When I start to see color appear, it means I've reached the edge and I'm throwing some pixels just over the edge a tiny bit. I can leave that much without worrying it, and if I lift both of my hands, I've increased the whites of this picture till they have their maximum white point. I now see a gap on the black's end, and I want to set a perfect black point, which means I want the blacks in this picture to just reach the point where they're pure black. So I go to the word blacks where there's a slider, and in order to be exact, I'm going to hold the Alt-Option key down again, and when I grab that pointer, my image turns white. And when I slide it to the left, I'm going to watch the white image, and when I start to see colors appear, it tells me that I have reached the black point, and I can be just at the edge of the black point and lift my hands, and I've set a pure black point in the image. So once the white point and the black point are established, I need to do a before and after test on the image. There are two possible ways to go back and look at the image before you worked on it. For new versions, down at the bottom of this window, I have 4 icons. And the second icon, when I point to it, says Swap Before and After Settings. And so I know if I click that icon, I'll go back to the original image before I worked on it. And if I click it again, I can see the change it made to correct the exposure. If you don't have that icon, you have an earlier version. Up at the top of the screen, you'll have a word called Preview, and it's got a little check mark. If you uncheck the preview, you'll do just what I did, and you'll send the image back to its original state, and you'll see how much we improved it just by correcting the exposure. When you are taking images right from your camera, be aware that if your image was not taken in Camera Raw, we have a way of opening that JPEG in this Camera Raw window and using these same controls. I need to tell you that the quality of the changes are always superior when you begin with a raw formatted file. But I have directions I can show you for taking a JPEG and opening it in this window so you can follow along and use these tools. And I hope once you do that and you see what great tools these are, you might decide to change your camera, if possible, to save that image in its raw format. It is no harder to work on a raw formatted file than to work on a JPEG. And too many photographers think that it must be really hard to work with raw files. It is certainly no harder than working with JPEG, and you will learn that when you use this window for a while. So let's go ahead with this raw file that you opened. Now that we have corrected the basic exposure, there are two things we're going to look at here. We're going to go to the top where it says white balance. If I set the white balance correct for the lighting when I took this picture, it will be absolutely perfect. But if I didn't capture it quite correct, I can adjust the warmth or coolness, which is the white balance, from the temperature slider. If I move it to the right, I'm adding yellow to the color. Try it and see what happens. It can get kind of ugly if you go too far, because it loses some of its quality when it's very yellow. If I want to set that back where it was, I can double click on that and it will jump back to where it was set, or I can go up to the white balance window and take it back to as shot. And now I have the white balance the way it was recorded. If you have a picture that you think the camera made a mistake and warmed it up too much, you can do the opposite. You can move the temperature slider down a little bit and make it cooler. That doesn't do what I want in this picture. But you notice when I move the temperature slider, the white balance goes to custom. That means I changed it. And if I take it back to as shot, I'm back the way the camera recorded the white balance. So this is an artistic slider. You must have a good visual memory of what is right for this picture. And if my memory was accurate enough and I thought that there was a bit more warmth in this picture when I looked at the scene, I can adjust the temperature slider. If I don't know, I'm going to leave it the way it came out of my camera. Then I'm going to go to the bottom three sliders. Clarity picks up the mid-tones, not the brights and not the extreme darks. And it adds a little contrast to the midpoint colors of this image. And if I take it and I drag it to the right and I watch the image, what happens when I drag it to the right is that the midtones develop more apparent sharpness. It's not the same thing as sharpening an entire image, but it grabs the midtones and gives me more contrast at the midtones of the image. If I don't know what I did with it, if I double click that clarity slider, it pops back to its setting. And this time when I drag it to the right, I'm going to watch the image and see what happens as I add clarity to it. And it does, I find somewhere around a plus 30 is an average amount of clarity to add. And I have enhanced the midtones of this image. Vibrance, if I were to tell you what Adobe says this slider does, it will technically say it finds the least saturated colors and it will enhance just the least saturated colors. In practice, I find that it enhances the blues in an image. And if you don't want to pull out the blues of that image, you will ignore the vibrant slider. If you want to see what it does, you can always go back to 0, grab it, drag it to the right. I hate what it did to that image. It cooled it off way too much. If I go way to the left, look how dull it is. I mean, the picture has no color at all. If I double click that slider, it goes back to its midpoint. And on this image, vibrance doesn't help me. Where you might like it is on an image with lots of sky. Sometimes if your picture was taken close to midday, you lose the blue in your sky, and the vibrant slider will bring it back. But for this picture, I'm not going to use it. And my rule of thumb is I normally don't touch the saturation. Because if I want to enhance a color in that image, I want to enhance a specific tone. I don't want to saturate the entire image. I normally don't use that slider. If I had an image that was washed out because of crazy light it was in, I might try the saturation, but in this case, I don't want to touch the saturation at this point because it's a global control. It will change the saturation of all colors. So I've done all I need to do in processing the original file to make the best exposure possible. And I'm ready to click Open Image. That will take all the adjustments I applied and keep them there when the image comes into the editor. This is where it needs to be to use Nik software in the Photoshop or in Photoshop Elements. So now that it's open, I'm ready to see what could I do to this image if I use the controls in Viveza2. So you don't have to change anything in this window at all, but to go up to the Filter menu and open it. And come to the bottom, you'll find Nik Collection. And if you slide your mouse to the right, you can come down and choose Viveza2. And when you have it highlighted, just click your mouse and it will open this image in the software for Viveza2. Let's look at what we get with this. In the folder of files that I gave you for the 3rd of June, I gave you the full tutorial for using Viveza2. If you don't have it when you're looking at my video, I want you to come down to the bottom left corner of this entire screen where you see the word Help. If you are connected to the internet and you click Help, it will take you to the full tutorial for Viveza2. I have taken most of that tutorial and put it into a PDF file so you could look at it without being on Viveza2 with an image. But for our point today, I'm going to point out the main sections of this and encourage you to use the full tutorial to become really conversant with this software. So let us look over at the right. You have a panel here and you have a scroll bar, and you can see the panel expands as the scroll bar comes down. For today, we're going to look at the 2 major controls. One is global controls. That's where everything I do will change the entire image. And we're going to look at control points, which will allow us to change one part of the image without changing the entire image. I normally would look at the global controls and see if any of them help the overall image. So if you look down through the sliders here, you could add brightness if it doesn't overdo the whites. Why don't you try a tiny bit of brightness to the right and a tiny bit of brightness to the right might look good. If I wonder, what did I do by that little tiny drag of that thing? I go up to the top of my Viveza2 window. I move to the left to a preview checkbox. This will go back to where it was when it opened. Can you see I enhanced the brightness a little bit? I have to decide whether that improves my image. If I do too much brightness, I'm going to blow out the bright water in the waterfall. So if I use any brightness, I'm going to be very careful. Does this image need contrast between the brights and the darks? I don't think so. I have bright water and dark rocks. I already have a lot of contrast. I'm not going to add to it. Do I want to saturate the whole image? I already told you that I don't want to saturate everything, so I'm going to skip that. The 4th one says structure. Structure is sort of like the clarity slider. Structure enhances the mid-tones by giving just the mid-tones more contrast. Let's see what happens to the rocks, especially up here. Can you see the rocks that are near the top? Those are pretty much midtones. Let's grab the structure slider and move it a little to the right. And notice how it punches up the rocks in the image. To see the difference, drag it back and drag it up again. Can you see how you can look at the change? As I drag it, my rocks are midtones and they get sharper. And if I lower it down, they come back to what they were. I kind of like that. So you just choose the point that you think enhances the midtones of the rocks and you leave it there. I now am coming to the lower set of adjustments. I do not want to lighten the shadows. I don't have shadows in here that are so dark that I think they need to be lifted. And that's because there's no dominant subject which is in deep shadow. The shadows I have are attractive. They add contrast to the image. So I'm going to skip the shadow adjustments. Warmth is like white balance. If I want to warm this picture up and I forgot to do it in Camera Raw, I can raise the warmth slider. We know what's going to happen. It's going to get yellowish. Try it. I don't like what it did. So I'm going to double click on that slider. Oh, it doesn't double click. So what do? I drag it back to the 0 point. And if I can't find the 0 point, I click on the percentage number and I type a 0. And that will take the warmth slider back to its 0 point. Are there reds to enhance? No way are there reds in that picture. Are there greens? Well, there might be. What do you think would happen? Let's try it. Grab the green slider. Now, it raises everything in that, doesn't it? I don't really like what the green slider does. So I'm going to click at the percentage and bring it back to 0. Well, we already practiced blue when we practiced how you could enhance your image in Camera Raw with the white balance that I didn't like it. So I'm going to leave all of those global sliders the way they are. The only one I really used was structure. But now I'm going to look at the image and say, are there parts of this image that I would like to enhance without changing the entire image? This is what the control points do. And control points in Nik software are rather unique. When I grab a control point, I click it. When I place it on an image, it is going to read the texture and tonality of the spot that I clicked. And my idea is the clouds at the top might be nice if they had more structure in them. But I don't want to enhance the structure of everything. So I'm taking my mouse with its control point and I'm going to put it up somewhere up here in the clouds where I have interesting contrast, maybe in here. I click once and I drop the control point over that part of the image. If you look carefully, opposite the point you just clicked, there is a slider. And that controls how much of the image you're going to look at. If I click on it, I get a circle. And if I make the circle too big, it's going to look for things that look like that texture throughout the image. I want to keep that point up in the clouds. And so I'm not going to get it too large. And I want you to know, if it doesn't enhance this side of the clouds, when I'm done, I can copy this point and I can duplicate it and I can put it over this side of the clouds and expand the area affected. So I'm going to work on the clouds, and I've already told you the only thing I want to do is add structure. So I could either come down to the little thing called ST which means structure, or come back over to your panel. Something has happened. Can you see the word selective? It's no longer global. When you add a control point, all of these controls are tied to that control point. And I find them easier to use than the little sliders attached to the control point. So come down to the structure, grab it and move it to the right and add structure to the clouds. And if you want to know what you've done, you're going to look at that control point by doing this. Come over to the scroll bar I pointed out before. Drag it down till you see the list of control points. They're bright colored yellow or orange. And the one that you have added controls 12% of the image. And if you wonder exactly what part of the image is being worked on, look at the black box to the right of 12%. Click it. And if you put a check mark in it, it shows you what part of the image are you working on. Can you see you're working on the clouds on the right side? The other thing for you to realize, and the way control points work, the strongest effect is under the control point, and as it moves away from the center, the effect gets less. And that's wonderful because you'll never see a sharp edge to where you make a change. To see my image again, I unclick that box and I get the image back. If I want to see what did I do to my image by adding that structure, look at the left end of that control point. Can you see the check mark at the left? You can turn off the control point. And your upper part goes back to what it was. Turn it on again and turn it off and notice the changes in the clouds. That's what you've done to that image from that one control point. And I promised you that if you want to add that same structure to the left side of the clouds, you can duplicate the point and move it over. And the way you do that is by using your friend the Alt-Option key. Hold it down and grab that control point and drag it to the left side of the thing and let go. You moved a copy of it over to the left. And now both sides have control points. So come back over to your bright colored thing. Can you see that the highlight is on the new control point too? If you want to see how much of the image did you add with control point 2, come to the right end and place your cursor over the black box. And then notice you added the left side of the clouds. Unclick that, come back to the image, and go to the left end where you have the bright orange check mark. Let's turn off this control point and turn it on again. Can you see how you added contrast to the left end of that image? That's what that extra copy of the control point did. So both of them are identical. You added the same amount of structure to both sides. If you would like to get rid of that fancy set of controls, take your mouse button out of the picture, put it over in this neutral area and click. It will turn off all of those fancy things, and if you look down at the list of control points, neither of them is active. They've gone back to gray, so they are not active any longer. And so I can take a look at the before and after of my image without seeing those big control point sliders. So come up to the top where we found the word preview, and to see what you've done to your image since you opened it, remove the check. This is what it looked like when you opened it in Viveza2, and this is how you've changed it. Two things we did. We changed the structure of the rocks. and we added additional structure to the clouds. And when I've decided that I've done enough, I'm done. I recognize in today's tutorial, we did not get to the bottom, which is the curves tool. So in class next week, we're going to work with that curves tool, something which you don't see in Photoshop Elements, but people in full Photoshop use a curves tool a lot. And you've got a curves tool when you come into Nix software. So we're stopping it for today, knowing we will come back and work with that next time. So what do I do to say I'm done with Viveza2? I recommend that you come over to the OK button. And the reason I recommend this is we all know how to add layer masks to images. The brush option is a rather complicated way to add a layer mask. And we know how to add layer masks, so we're going to use the OK one. And when you click it, you're going to go over and wait for it to apply Viveza2 to your image. And it's applying it on a new layer. And you already should have pop into your mind right away why that's helpful. If you overdid Viveza2 and you said, oh, darn it, I overdid it, how can you reduce the effect? You can go up to the opacity slider. Now, I'm not recommending that I want to reduce it, but notice what happens. When you lower the opacity slider, you reduce the Viveza controls. If I take them to 0, I've got the image back the way it was before I worked on Viveza. And if I come back all the way to the right to 100%, I have the full effect. And of course, when it's valuable, you can reduce it. But I don't think I overdid that, so I'm not going to reduce it. And of course, before you finish a job on an image, if it's your image, you will want to be sure you save it as a PSD file so you keep that Viveza layer with the saved image. So you can go back later and do other things to it. If I saved it as a JPEG, my Viveza layer would be moved into the background and I couldn't go back and work it. So images that we are working on and where we've added a layer should always be saved as a Photoshop document. That's a .psd document. But you're working on a sample of one of my images, which was provided for you to learn how to use Viveza. So I recommend that you close it without saving it. So simply go up, hit your button to close the file, and say don't save.